Hello, welcome to this webinar by the NCCHPP, National Collaborating Center for Healthy Public Policy. Please note that the audio is transmitted to you only through the teleconference line. We are also experiencing a small glitch with the system, which means we are not able to unmute you. So we are asking for your collaboration. Please mute your phones so there is no background noise during the presentation. Also use the chat box to let us know if you experience any technical problems during the presentation. My name is Florence Forrestin. I am a scientific advisor at the NCCHPP. I am assisted by two of my colleagues today. Mylène Magloire is registered under the name Campus Virtuel. She will help you if you experience technical difficulties. And we also have my colleague, Michael Keeling. Michael will help me with managing your questions during question periods. On this topic, please do not hesitate to type your questions as we go along. There will be 3 question periods during the presentation, and during these I will respond to the questions in between. That said, just to mention, we have a lot of people on the line today, so if I don't manage to answer all your questions during this hour, perhaps I could share written responses with all of you by email afterwards. So, a few words about the NCCHPP. We belong to a network of 6 collaborating centers located in different regions of Canada and financed by the Public Health Agency of Canada. And our mandate at the NCCHPP is to support public health actors in their efforts to promote healthy public policies. Before I go further, I declare that I have no real or potential conflict of interest related to the material that is being presented today. I declare, however, that I have a pretty nasty cold. My apologies if I sneeze during the presentation. So, policy briefs. They have become popular over the last 15 years or so as a way to share knowledge with policymakers. And by knowledge, I mean evidence drawn from research. This is important to specify because the term brief or briefing note was borrowed from political circles, where it refers to a short note intended to inform a policymaker. This type of note is produced by a policymaker's collaborators and may be based on different types of information.
This call is being recorded. If you do not wish to be recorded, please disconnect at this time.
In fact, a number of you who are attending this webinar today are analysts in ministerial departments. So I want to specify that the policy briefs we are going to be talking about today are those produced by persons or organizations who are trying to influence policy development from the outside. So if you are working in political circles, some of the findings I will present here may be useful to you, but others will not apply to your situation. I prefer to justify that from the start. Yes, policy briefs have become popular as a way to share knowledge, but how effective are they at this? At the NCCHPP, we commissioned a literature review, which was conducted by Caroline Tessier from Quebec's Public Health Institute. The literature review was aimed at answering 2 questions. First, what are the criteria to consider for writing effective policy briefs? And second, are there any relevant guides to support the writing of policy briefs? This work will be published by early fall. Today I will give an overview and I will complement with other tips on how to produce a policy brief. So by the end of the webinar, you should be able to understand the potential and the limits of policy for sharing knowledge. You should be able to plan the production of a brief, and to make an informed choice from among possible content elements and formats for a policy brief. Now, Obviously, I'm not able to explore everything in depth in 1 hour. So to help you pursue this work afterwards, I will present at the end the best writing guides found by Caroline Tessier during her literature review. So just to remind you, we are not able to mute you, so please collaborate and mute your own phone. Thank you, to avoid background noise. So on this slide, you can see a few examples of policy briefs. If you wish to consult them, I have provided the references at the end of the presentation, which will be online as of tomorrow on the NCCHPP's website. So you see these pretty looking documents. Of course, if we are talking about briefs produced for people inside your organization, there is no need to work as hard on the presentation. But I do not have an example of an internal policy brief to show you because, well, these are simply not published. In any case, content is the most important element, and I will be focusing on this over the visual aspects. Now, why did I choose to show a few briefs rather than start with a definition? Well, that's because there are very different conceptions of policy briefs, even if we only consider those that present evidence. So very different conceptions, beginning with what these documents are called. A bit as a joke, I put the famous verse here, a rose is a rose is a rose, because no such thing exists in the universe of policy briefs. The terms policy brief and its French translation, note de briefage, are the most common, but in both languages, many other terms are used. And in addition, in her literature review, Tessier found that the documents labeled policy briefs do not all share the same characteristics, either in terms of their contents or their formats, which can be quite confusing. However, we can still identify some defining characteristics if we get back to the terms. So policy suggests a certain object and therefore a certain type of target audience, and brief, well, brief tells us something about the format. So the object or purpose of the policy brief, their content varies depending on the evidence available and the choices made by the authors, which we will discuss later. But what's common to policy briefs is their purpose. They are meant to concretely orient policy action to inform decision-making related to the selection, development, adoption, or implementation of a public policy. Because we are talking about policy, points a certain type of audience. Policy briefs are intended for policymakers and their collaborators. So in the registration form, I asked who are the policy briefs you produce intended for. For those of you who responded, I have grouped your answers into broad categories. So you can see on these slides, the circles are proportional to the number of responses. Okay, pause here.
Hello everyone, we have an issue with the phone, so we are not able to mute everyone. We are hearing someone typing, we are hearing background noise, so please, please mute your own phone. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks Mylène for this reminder. So, as I said, I grouped your answers into broad categories. So it appears that you produce policy briefs mostly for ministerial departments, municipal governments, and public health organizations, essentially at the local or regional level. Within ministerial departments, you mentioned the whole year are writing for mid-level executives, directors, directors general, deputy ministers, ministers. Within public health organizations as well, your briefs are addressed either to managers, senior managers, medical officers of health, even for some of you to the board of health. And as you can notice, especially in public health organizations, many of these briefs are internal briefs, so produced for people within your own organization. Other intended audiences you mentioned are indigenous leaders, members of parliament, parliamentary committees, and then I created the other category. You mentioned several types of audiences, well, stakeholders, generally speaking, a school district, local service boards, decision makers in hospitals or clinics. You also mentioned health providers, academics, the public. A few comments. The policy brief is not a recommended tool to address the public because the policy brief is directed toward a professional audience. So to reach the public, it's suggested instead that you use the media or social media. Some of the other audiences you mentioned are in a position to adopt organizational policies, not public policies. That's the case of workplaces, for example. And as for your audiences who are not policymakers, maybe the reason you want to use a policy brief to address them is so they will use it in turn to influence policymakers. Anyway, further on, I am going to talk about how to identify the target audience for your policy brief. Okay, now let's talk about the format of briefs. Keeping in mind that the policy brief is intended for policymakers, in your opinion, what should be the ideal length for these documents? We have opened a quick poll here. I will pause as you enter your responses. Okay, a clear majority, around 2 pages. Okay, so definitely most of you chose the 2 pages options, and if not, you were suggesting short documents between 1 and 4 pages. So, thank you for your answers. The ideal length for a policy brief is amply discussed in the literature, and there is enormous variation. There are documents of 30 to 40 pages labeled policy briefs. However, and most of you certainly know it, given the responses you have given, lack of time is a major barrier to the use of evidence in political circles. So many authors agree on certain norms. If you are addressing subject matter or information processing specialists, they suggest that you keep the brief below 6 pages. And if you are addressing a non-specialist audience, that you keep it between 2 to 4 pages. And by the way, addressing non-specialists includes when we are talking about public health to other sectors. So that's a thing to remember. All this is not necessarily easy to do in practice. So if you are a bit scared by these short formats, one thing to remember is that the policy brief does not have to contain everything, not everything from your study or knowledge synthesis or whatever. It is intended to pique the reader's interest, to open a dialogue, and you may share, you may go into further detail later in the discussion that ensues. Okay, that was about the characteristics of policy briefs. We come now to one of the central questions explored by Tessier in her literature review, Is the policy brief an effective tool for sharing knowledge with policymakers? But first of all, what do we mean by effective? Here, it's useful to break down the stages involved in taking evidence into account within political circles. So as you can see on this figure, the first step is for evidence to be actually taken into consideration. Maybe this will lead to further reflection among political actors. Maybe, in turn, this could lead to an intention to use the evidence, which maybe would turn into actual use, which maybe could influence public policies. So I insisted on purpose on the word maybe, because evidence can make it until one of these stages, then be discarded. Now, what do existing studies on the effectiveness of policy briefs focus on? The first thing that Tessier observed is that policy briefs are frequently used but rarely evaluated. And the majority of the studies she found tell us about the likelihood that the policy brief will be taken into consideration in political circles. So these studies focus on the preferences of policymakers with regard to briefs. Preferences were evaluated either in real-life situations or during experiments. And in some articles, actually, it is simply the authors of policy briefs who are describing preferences that they have observed in political circles. Because of the limited number of studies focusing on policy briefs, Tessier had to supplement her review with indirect data. So studies on factors that support or limit the consideration of evidence in general, not necessarily from policy briefs. So that was about the consideration of evidence. Among the studies, Tessier found some of them measured the intention to use the evidence presented in the brief. On the other hand, she found nothing on the actual use of this evidence, which is somehow understandable because it is difficult to assess. But in short, the bulk of the data available focus on the initial consideration, the start of the process, not on the subsequent outcome of a policy brief. Still, this is not trivial because if evidence is excluded right from the outset, none of the subsequent stages can occur. And it also makes sense that data on policy briefs are concentrated in this area because of the added value offered by this type of documents, a user-friendly format to draw attention to evidence.
Yeah, I'll message her too, Denise. Bless you.
Yeah, again, a reminder, we are not able to mute you, so please mute your own phone. Thank you. What about the data I just mentioned? Are they generalizable? Well, there are some limits, of course. There is, of course, the context on which the studies are focused. For instance, some of the studies found by Tessier focus on policymakers in the health sector. This does not tell us about the preferences in other sectors of government. And even the topic of a brief can modify policymakers' preferences. I will come back to this. Another issue with generalizability is that the brief does not exist in a vacuum, and its effectiveness also depends on how its authors share it. So a good policy brief may be shared at the wrong moment with the wrong contact persons or through poor channels of dissemination. So the effectiveness of the knowledge sharing strategy also matters, but studies on the effectiveness of policy briefs evaluate this dimension less often. So what should we conclude? Is it worth producing policy briefs? Well, mainly yes. Many studies suggest that policymakers are more inclined to consider evidence when it is presented in a condensed form. However, have realistic expectations about the outcome. But, I mean, that's always the case when it comes to the use of evidence in political circles. The available evidence also indicates trends in policymakers' preferences, and the advice I will present in this webinar is based on these trends. However, I will repeatedly remind you to analyze your context, including the needs and expectations of the audience you are addressing. And this is what I will begin with in the next part of the webinar, but first, I will take a few minutes to address any questions you have. So please use the chat box to type your questions.
I see there are a few people typing here. Maybe while we wait for a question or two to come in, Florence, could you just mention again when the literature review is expected to be out?
Okay, yeah, it should be out by early fall. I'd say September probably. So if you're interested, you could register to the NCCHPP e-bulletin. It will be, publication will be announced in the bulletin. Yeah, I see that people are typing, so we'll wait for you.
There will be a couple other opportunities to ask questions, and so if we don't have anything coming up in a minute or two, we'll move on.
Okay, so Lina, in which format the brief should be distributed, electronic or hard copy? That's really a matter of the preference of the people you are addressing. I will, yeah, so in the next part of the webinar, I will invite you to analyze your audience. That's where you can find the answer to that kind of questions. Examples of good policy briefs anywhere. Well, the ones I used as an example at the beginning, I mean, a brief is as good as the goal you want to reach with it and the audience you are addressing. So all this is extremely contextual. But I will comment later on features of the policy brief that you should use to make them, how would I say, interesting for the reader. So many questions have entered.
Here's an interesting one from
yes.
Tracy.
Yeah, Mike.
Is there suggested evidence about the most effective channels to share policy briefs through to staff, elected officials, etc.?
No, again, there are not. And I apologize if I appear to give the same answer again and again, but it really depends on the context and who you are addressing. I mean, there is debate around addressing elected officials, so policymakers versus their collaborators. There's, of course, you have more power on one side, more accessibility, more opportunity for dialogue on the other side. Well, I mean, at the NCCHPP, I have published a whole literature review focusing on this, how to interact with the collaborators of policymakers, what are the advantages in doing so, and the limits. So this is one of the papers referenced at the end. Maybe you could refer to that paper. So other questions?
There's a different line of inquiry from Christine. She asked, should produce a policy brief only on request, or can it be a means of regular communication with decision makers?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it could be both things. You could be asked for the production of a policy brief, or you could be proactive and use it to create interest among an audience that you want to target, and let them know about what you're working on and how it relates to their policy area. Okay, because there are a lot of questions here, I will move on. None of your questions will be ignored. So if we don't have time to cover them in the next question periods, there will be answers in written after the webinar. Okay, we are so many on the line that I have to do a bit of time management here. So, producing a policy brief. We will look at planning, writing, and briefly at dissemination. And the aim is to avoid common mistakes, such as not considering whether the brief is the appropriate tool, targeting too many audiences, focusing solely on the aesthetics, writing the brief without keeping the target audience in mind, and viewing the brief as an end in itself. So, planning. You need to consider how the policy brief fits into the overall context of your knowledge sharing strategy. So, first question to ask is, who is the intended audience for the knowledge you wish to share? At this stage, really, we are not yet talking about the brief, just about the knowledge you want to share in general. So, are you trying to reach an internal audience, external, multiple audiences? Well, if it's an internal audience, normally you know them pretty well. They're people from your own organization. But as soon as you're trying to reach an external audience, you benefit from mapping the actors involved. So who should you try to map? Deal with the policymakers concerned by the subject on which you are working. So what level of government is responsible? Municipal, provincial, territorial, federal, or several of them? Second, what is the branch of government you should address? In political systems in Canada, it is usually ministerial departments that define policy orientations. But there also are opportunities to share knowledge in legislative assemblies, for instance, during consultations organized by parliamentary committees. You also need to consider sectors of government. So the various ministerial or municipal departments, each with their own portfolio. And generally forget the idea that there is one policymaker, because this is seldom the case. Take the example of cannabis legalization. The decision was made by the federal government. Implementation is decided by the provinces, which is why the legal age for consuming and the sales system vary from one province and territory to another. And municipalities as well, they can adopt bylaws to prohibit consumption in public places. And if you think of the government sectors concerned, these include health, justice, public safety, to name only a few. Note that so far I've been talking about policymaking organizations, but if we're talking about individuals, actors can be the policymakers themselves, so mayors, ministers, etc., or can be their collaborators, public servants and political advisors. Remember that these collaborators are the ones who process the information that feeds into public policy development. Once you have mapped the relevant policymakers, who are the other actors concerned by your subject? You could think of community organizations, businesses, citizen groups, etc. And once you have identified all the actors concerned, policymakers and others, a useful exercise is to position them according to their interest in the subject and their power. Just a pause. I've lost the connection on my computer. Okay, it has come back. Just let us know if you experience any problem on your side. So here on this slide, I refer you to two tools that you will find in the NCCHPP's guide for developing a knowledge sharing plan. This guide isn't perfect. It was originally developed to meet our internal needs at the NCCHPP, so some of its recommendations don't apply to other organizations. And also, frankly, it isn't particularly innovative. It's mainly based on other resources. But it adapts these other resources to knowledge sharing related to public policies, and it presents a comprehensive approach. And it's available in Word format. So it provides a template for a structured knowledge sharing plan that can be filled in. Once you have a complete portrait of the actors concerned by your subject, you are able to make an informed choice about who it would be most relevant to address. So identify your target audiences, the ones with whom you will share knowledge, and then among them, distinguish between primary and secondary audiences. Your primary audiences are those in whom you will invest more effort. There are several possible criteria for choosing your audiences. An important one is your goal in sharing knowledge. So, for example, is your goal to really influence or try to influence a policy decision which would lead you to address policymakers and their collaborators? Or is it to stimulate political debates because there are no chances of securing a policy victory currently? Therefore, you better reach out to elected members of opposition parties. Is your goal to influence public opinion, in which case you could address the media? Or is it to raise the awareness of other organizations so they can advocate in your place because you consider it's not part of your mandate? So then your audience could be community organizations, for instance. So as you see, your goal in sharing knowledge can lead you in different directions when it comes to choosing your primary audiences. Once you have identified these audiences, analyze their information needs and preferences. And at this point, not before, is the time for asking yourself whether a policy brief is the right tool to address your audience. It might be that you will need different tools for different audiences. We have here a quotation from a legislative advisor explaining, I need a short summary for my boss, but I also need the long version so that I can fully understand the research and verify its accuracy. So you really have to think the tool based on the expectations and needs of the audience. And even if, based on the preferences of your different audiences, a policy brief would be the appropriate tool to address them, these different audiences may not share the same priorities, the same interest in the various facets of the subject under discussion, or the same background knowledge. So actually, each of these audiences may need a different version of the policy brief. So, of course, we don't always have the resources to produce several versions of the brief. But at the very least, don't assume the policy brief you write will be suitable for everyone. And so carefully prioritize your target audiences so you can focus your thoughts while writing on the one that matters most. In a nutshell, with whom should you plan the production of the policy brief? A collective process is a more effective way to call into question your assumptions, your usual ways of doing things. So start by discussing that with your team. In any case, generally, producing a brief involves teamwork. Strictly speaking, the writer may work alone, although responsibility may be shared among subject specialists, knowledge brokers, communication specialists. And besides, usually the brief must be approved by a supervisor for internal dissemination or by your organization for external dissemination. So normally they will add their input during planning. And you also have every reason to consult your primary audiences to determine their preferences and needs. Or you can instead consult intermediaries who know them well. So I will pause here again for questions.
A couple of questions came in while you were speaking, so I could maybe give you a couple of those while we see if any others come up. Joanne just wrote, do you need to include citations in policy briefs?
You mean references, I suppose?
Yes.
Yes, you do. I will address that just afterwards. You do so that readers that got an interest in the topic can find further details if they want to. The suggestion in the literature is to keep the list of references rather short, so maybe not more than 10 to 15 references.
A question from a while back. Can you use a policy brief to show that there is no evidence to support a policy?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Why not?
And here's one that just came up. If your primary audience is someone that you don't have access to, for example, a deputy minister, how do you recommend gaining an understanding of their level of knowledge?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's exactly a point where I would suggest that you reach out to public servants. It's not a one-off. So you contact people, and over time, because you work on the same topic, you on your side, them within the ministry, you can exchange information. And then when you have such questions to ask, to sense what's the temperature, if I may say, within the ministerial department, these people will be able to tell you, to give you insights.
A couple of related questions, one from earlier and one that just came up, and they relate to the a rose is a rose is a rose slide. One was about policy briefs and the differences between them and briefing notes. And I don't know if a briefing note would fit into that little cluster of types of document. Maybe you could speak to that. And also, just came up, what's the difference between policy brief and policy note?
Okay. I would say no differences. What I observed is that briefing notes is definitely a very current term within political circles. Well, those of you working in political circles, don't hesitate to correct me if I'm wrong. But policy briefs appears to be a term that was really crafted more by research circles as a tool they wanted to use to convey evidence to political circles. So that's my comment on that. The point with the terms and the kind of documents they are attached to is there is no consistency. So, I mean, as I said, there are documents that are labeled policy briefs, but that are like 40 or 50 pages long. So there's nothing much in a name in that case, I would say.
Okay. Here's one from Matt. It's up on the screen. It's a snapshot in time. Should we build in timelines for updating policy briefs regularly, or just when new evidence comes out?
Okay. I will address that at the end of the presentation. So I will just leave this question aside for now.
Okay, maybe just a quick comment on Sandra's question, which is about a format that was always or almost always used in military context, half-page bullet point summary of talking points for whatever briefing. Do you recommend this with policy briefs?
It's definitely a different context. So I do not recommend any approach in particular. I mean, I give guidelines in this webinar based on the literature review conducted by Caroline Tessier. But again, you have to adapt these guidelines based on your analysis of your context and your audience. So that's what I would say. So we will move along with the section about writing the policy brief. So starting with the visual aspects, that's one of the characteristics of policy briefs. I won't spend too much time on this, since the writing guides recommended at the end address this more fully. I just want to draw your attention to a few features. The use of bulleted lists and text boxes to highlight key messages, a lot of subtitles and plenty of white space to facilitate reading, illustrations, so pictures but also examples, concrete cases, and tables or graphics, but note that they should be designed in a way that actually helps readers understand the information. Of course, photos and a nice graphic design are not necessary in an internal brief, but in an unsolicited brief produced for an external audience, the value of visual elements is that they help attract the reader's attention. If you choose to refine the graphic design, it is not easy for everyone, so you may want to work with professionals, either the communications department within your organization, if there is one, or with external professionals. Anyway, all of the other elements mentioned on this slide are not there just to make the brief look nice. They are there to help effectively convey the content. Because the content is even more important than the visual aspect. So producing a brief does not mean just adding a nice graphic design to your research report. You need to rethink the content as well. On the basis of her literature review, Tessier has identified the major components of a policy brief. Of course, the subsections within these components vary depending on the subject addressed. Here I am going to focus on the section on results and implications, which constitutes the heart of the brief. I will briefly go over the other components, and again, you will be able to explore these in greater depth by consulting the guides proposed at the end. So the title should be catchy. Piece of advice, do not reuse the title of your scientific article. Highlights or a summary is needed, even though a brief is a short document. This is because the reader may not read the rest, so you have to highlight the key messages. A section on context serves to position the subject addressed, describe the current state of affairs, and convince the reader of the need to act. And yes, that was a question posed earlier. Yes, you do have to include, or is it it's suggested in the literature that you include a short list of references. All this should be written in language that is simple but not simplistic. You are addressing professionals. So, the summary of the evidence within the brief. Frequently, the situation is that you need to transform a 40-page report into a 4-page policy brief. So what should you not do? Summarize each section of the report and paste them together, because this results in an indigestible summary. So ask yourself first, is it relevant to transmit all the results to your readers? Instead, it is suggested to focus on what is most relevant to them, given their role, given the issues they are currently concerned with. The relevance of the subject is a central factor that promotes the use of evidence. So, for example, a study that deals with the working conditions of agricultural workers may be used to produce a brief that focuses only on the risk of heat stroke, and other briefs may be produced on other aspects that have been studied. And even with regard to the aspect that you are going to focus on, you don't need to include everything. As mentioned earlier, there will be opportunities for discussing details later if the policy brief manages to spark a dialogue. You should also adopt your reader's perspective and explain what the evidence means for someone in that position. And you can see here the relevance of analyzing your audiences and of producing different briefs for different audiences. Now, I have a question for you. Should we describe research methods in a policy brief? So here's another quick poll. Pause a moment to let you enter your answers. Okay, there's a majority for the no. I don't see any more answers coming in, so we will move along. Okay, the answer is it depends. Again, it depends on the expectations of your intended audience. It also depends on how much they trust you. That's a finding by Moat and his colleagues. They conducted a large-scale literature review to identify factors that influence policymakers' preferences with regard to policy briefs. So they found that if your readers trust you, they will also consider the brief reliable. So there's less of a need to describe your methods. In contrast, they also found that if the brief focuses on a polarizing subject, your readers want to be assured that they can use the content in a debate without the evidence being discredited. So in this case, they need to know what research methods were used, even if they trust you. If you describe research methods, don't go into details, and remember that it's not so much the research method itself that matters as its implications for the research results. So explain these implications to your readers. How much certainty should they place in the evidence presented? Why does contradictory evidence exist? Possibly because different research methods were used in different study populations, etc. So really, you have to help your reader interpret what this means for the evidence presented. Okay, now the section on policy options and recommendations. This is central since the aim of the brief is to inform policymaking, but this aspect is also the subject of debate, and you may feel uncomfortable about it, which is normal. We are not trained in public health to, from the start, to produce policy recommendations. In any case, remember that we are talking about briefs that present evidence, and the recommendations made should be based on that evidence. They also should be precise, concrete, and formulated with the context and the reader in mind. So, for example, if you are addressing a municipal policymaker, don't recommend doing something which is the responsibility of the federal government. Ideally, try to summarize the advantages and disadvantages of the proposed policy options, so their known or potential effects, also indications about their applicability, the costs they would entail, their acceptability to various actors. You may need to rely on complementary data to document these aspects. But the idea is not to provide a comprehensive analysis on these aspects. It's rather to provide your readers with some indications. Now, the debates. Briefs may be positioned on a continuum ranging from neutral to interventionist. Neutral policy briefs suggest different policy options without indicating a preference. By contrast, the authors of more interventionist briefs position themselves in favor of one policy option. But there are differing points of view in the literature regarding the relevance of doing this, so putting forward one favored policy option. Another issue under debate is how far should we go to persuade? So some authors suggest including in the brief a story that engages the emotions and appeals to the values of readers as a more powerful way to draw their attention to the evidence. The example shown here is a detail from a policy brief about problems accessing mammography that was sent to Missouri legislators, and that included testimony from a woman with cancer. But of course, again, there is a gradation, a continuum in the types of stories that can be presented. A more neutral approach would be to include an example case. We all do this to illustrate our points. It's not the same as presenting a deliberately poignant story to move readers. Another persuasion strategy that is the subject of debate is framing. Paul Kearney defines this as the strategic use of information to draw attention to a particular interpretation of a problem. And the fact of focusing on a certain interpretation also leads us to favor certain solutions over others. So this brief on mammography is neutral in reality. Its authors propose different policy options, free mammograms for uninsured women, mobile screening units, information campaigns directed toward women, reminders sent to physicians, etc. But an example of framing would be to say the main problem concerning access to mammography is that some women cannot afford it, and therefore to recommend free mammograms. Another example of framing would be to say the main problem in our rural state, Missouri, is that mammography services are concentrated in large cities, and the majority of women have to travel too far for access. And with this framing, the recommendation would be mobile mammography units. Of course, to be strategic, one should choose a way of framing the problem that will resonate with their audience, or be close to the way it already prefers to frame this problem. So in the case of this policy brief, the authors may have thought that elected officials would be more sensitive to problems related to geographical access that affect their voters in rural areas, and therefore decide to focus on this facet of the problem and recommend mobile mammography units. And conversely, they might choose not to recommend free services because in the U.S. context, this is a controversial subject. That said, it should be emphasized that framing does not necessarily mean distorting the evidence. Okay, so in this example, there are, in fact, data concerning access problems for women in rural areas. The framing here involves focusing on this facet of the problem and placing it in the forefront. So I would like to invite you to share your arguments for and against interventionist policy briefs. So the ones that include just one policy option and that present more persuasive content. So please use these two chat boxes to type your comments. Okay. So we can see some of your comments coming in. Yeah, really interesting comments. Yeah, really great. So, Michael, would you like to comment a little on the arguments for, and I will comment on arguments against?
Sure. Some of the ones we see in there helps to identify key recommendations, helps to focus on the issue and on research. One solution may emerge as being really the best one based on the evidence, so that would be a reason for supporting that. related to that, use when evidence is strong and clear what direction to take. So sometimes it may just naturally flow from what the evidence says. Someone may need some clear recommendation to help them make a decision. It denotes urgency, brief and clear, more focused. They keep coming.
Okay.
What are some of the reasons not to?
Arguments against a lot about paternalism, telling us what to do. Maybe you think the audience would react to that, react negatively to that. The risk of confirmation bias, difference between being an academic versus an advocate, be seen as partisan. Someone said less informative. A lot of comments about bias, actually. Someone mentioning maybe seen as the best option based on evidence but not public opinion, which also matters for policymakers. Okay, I'll try to recap some arguments for and against. Thank you for your active participation. The main advantage is that being more interventionist can contribute to the effectiveness of the message. The reason why some authors propose framing and storytelling is because it allows you to exploit the way policymakers make decisions. So the need to simplify complex problems to be able to make a decision. Also, the fact that policymakers base their policy choices not only on their values, but also on their values, so appealing to that through stories. On the side of the disadvantages, well, you run the risk of compromising the scientific credibility of the brief, your reputation, or your relationship of trust, be it in the eyes of your target audience, or even if the way you did was well received with your target audience, you may compromise your reputation in the eyes of other actors, your peers, for example. And as some of you mentioned, you might also not think that it is not your role as researchers or public health professionals to engage in that kind of action. So, a few ways to move beyond the debates based on what was found in the literature. On the based on the policymakers' perspective, so their preferences, you still should draw attention to a specific problem in the brief, provide a clear interpretation of the results because policymakers want to know what is the takeaway message from the evidence presented, describe the actions to be taken because policymakers don't want to have to deduce these actions, but on the other hand, don't make recommendations based on mixed results because, again, your audience does not want to be attacked in a debate when using the evidence you provided them. And even if you don't present just one policy option, limit the number of options proposed. Moat also found that the more your audience trusts you, the more they it increases their desire to receive explicit recommendations from you. And of course, your perspective matters. It's a case-by-case decision to be made. Some of you mentioned that it depends on the strength of the evidence. It depends on the situation. There are cases in which public health decides to sound the alarm and take stronger positions, and it depends on the expectations of your target audience. Whatever your choice, you need to be comfortable with it and its potential consequences. And most of the time, the decision is not up to you personally. It will be an organizational decision. In a nutshell, a few words about dissemination. Well, internal briefs are obviously confidential. Other briefs tend to be broadly disseminated, probably because if you invested a lot of effort to produce them. You may want to publish them. But this is something to think about strategically, because in some cases, broad dissemination can result in your primary audience going on the defensive. Mentioned several times, the brief is not an end in itself. It's the start for a dialogue. Also note that your brief has not reached the end of its road. If it is actually taken into consideration, it may be transformed by policymakers' collaborators. They may rewrite it in their own words, summarize it, reframe it, combine it, its content with other types of information. Ask yourself if you wish to participate in this process, if your contacts, your policy contacts would like that, because your participation may avoid certain reinterpretation of the evidence. And finally, that was the question raised earlier. You disseminate your brief at one point in time, but also think about the longer term. So redisseminate it when windows of opportunity occur. That could be a change of government, media coverage related to your subject, or, as one of you mentioned, when new evidence emerges. The guides I've mentioned several times over the webinar. These are the 3 best writing guides identified by Caroline Tessier among the 26 she reviewed. They are really complementary to each other, so if you are intending to produce a brief, I really suggest that you read them all. They are really user-friendly, and as you can see, they do not focus on the same stages of the production of a brief. So really good resources. We have exceeded a bit the time for this webinar. I'm sorry about that, but I will keep online for a few minutes if you have more questions to ask. So I suggest if you asked a question earlier that was not answered, maybe just raise your hand and we will retrace it. Or if you have new questions, please type them in. Okay, there was a question about position papers and policy briefs. Not my area of expertise, but I would risk to comment that a position paper, the name says it really takes, I mean, the goal is really to take a strong position on an issue. So I would say the policy brief is more balanced. I'd say in the way it presents recommendations flowing from the evidence that it contains as well. A position paper is more centered on recommendations only. That would be my comment on that. Okay, I can see no more questions coming in. I will still review the one you asked earlier and provide written responses by email.
Maybe you want to pass through the references so that they're on the recording?
Yeah, sure.
Slides? Yeah.
Absolutely. So that's what you can find in the slides. They will be posted on the NCCHPP website. Links to the briefs that were presented earlier, complete references that were cited. And that's it. So thank you for participating today and being really reactive during the presentation.